it! I'm Coy Jandro, a Bostonian who loves pop culture, comic books, and people. And I host Coycast. It's a podcast about all those things. If it fits in on a con floor, we talk about it on Coycast. Myself and producer Jake do previews, reviews, deep dives, and tinfoil hat theories about everything from movies, TV, and the comic books themselves. I also like to dish out comic recommendations from my 100-plus pull list a week so you know what's best to buy. So join us, True Believer, on Coycast.com or wherever you're listening to this podcast right now.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
And here we are, fellow Quillers, back again for another new episode of your favorite podcast. And I say that because I know it's true. I know that all of our fellow Quiller listeners mark Don't Quill the Messenger among their favorite podcasts. And if you haven't already gone in and given us a rate and a review wherever you get your podcasts, please do that because it helps share the message with other people. We welcome back to the program today one of our favorite guests. He's been here multiple times. I think he holds the record as our most frequent guest of Don't Quill the Messenger. He is Dr. Earl Showerman, and he is here today, as promised, fellow Quillers, to discuss Troilus and Cressida and the autobiographical nature of that play and how it relates to the life of Edward de Vere. And there are some exciting aspects of this very lesser-known play and sort of dismissed play that I think is going to, those facts are going to really intrigue you. I think it's going to make you want to go back and reread the play. And I think it's going to make it one of your new favorites among the canon after Earl and I share with you some of these details. And of course, some of those details have to do with the ancient Greeks, which is Earl's number one specialty. And that's why we called him in here today to discuss this fabulous, what is also often called a problem play. Welcome back, Earl.
Oh, thanks so much, Stephen. And I really appreciate the invitation because it forced me to go back and take a look at notes from previous presentations that I've given on this play, and it alerted me to the fact that this has never been written up. And so now, not only am I obligated to talk to you today about it, but I got to write it up for some journal in the near future because it's so loaded with both political allegorical content and many passages that suggest Shakespeare was very familiar with a wide spectrum of literary sources that come from the ancient Greeks. This is perhaps one of the most literary rich source plays in the entire canon.
It has connections, doesn't it, to Homer's Iliad, to Virgil's Aeneid, and to Ovid's Metamorphoses. All three of the big ones are connected to this play.
Well, then you have to add Caxton and John Lydgate's Troy book, which are very critical for much of the content over the Trojan War scenes and under the war plot, but also Chaucer for the romance plot between Cressida and Troilus. And then you have allusions to a variety of Greek sources, including Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, with certain passages that the author is clearly familiar with, and just putting a whole melange of sources that are ancient, classical, Renaissance, and medieval all into one play. So it's truly a melange of sources and is a melange of genres. I mean, it's very hard to define. Most scholars say that it's a tragic comedy, or they call it a satire, or they say that it's a history, tragedy, romance, and comedy all wrapped in one. And looking at David Bevington's Arden edition of it, he really reviews what other commentators have had to say about this play, and it's really quite remarkable that it combines so many elements from a variety of genres that it is self-consciously enriched by a huge variety of sources, unlike many of the plays.
It has been touched upon by a couple of our famous Oxfordian writers. I know Bill Farina has a chapter about it in his book, De Vere as Shakespeare, which is a wonderful little chapter on it, but not very extensive.
Right.
Has great details in it, but it's not very long. And Mark Anderson, of course, in Shakespeare by Another Name, touches on it in a few places. One of the things I find interesting about those two writers is they have differing viewpoints on what the message of the play is and what the autobiographical context is. And I love that because regardless of which author you agree with, both of them point specifically to Edward de Vere and that it had to be Edward de Vere. It doesn't matter whether you believe that Cressida is Anne Vavasour or you believe that Cressida is the queen, or maybe you believe that she's an amalgamation of both. I tend to believe that she's like all three women, and Cecil and Vavasour and the queen, all of whom at some point our guy felt betrayed by at some point in his life. And one of the things I love about Cressida is she's the only female character in the canon who actually does commit adultery. Other women get accused of it, but are innocent. She's the only one who's actually guilty.
Well, Stephen, I hope to convince you that Anne Vavasour is the model for Cressida in more ways than one, and that this is a very early play, and that there is numerous references that suggest that the first version of this play was written in 1584 or earlier. That is to say, 20 years, virtually 15 to 20 years earlier than most scholars will date the play around 1600, and that it pertained to a political and personal situation that the Earl of Oxford was facing crises in the early 1580s. So that's the argument I'm going to present today when we get down into it. Now, I think what we have at this play is problematic in more ways than you can possibly count, and that is to say, what was the date that it was written? Well, the dating is a problem because we have it registered in 1603, but unpublished. That is to say, it was a blocking registration in 1603. And then mysteriously in 1609, it gets published the same year as the sonnets are published, after 3 or 4 years in which no Shakespeare plays are played. And you have two competing quarto editions, one that calls it the history of Troilus and Cressida. The other one calls it the famous history of Troilus and Cressida. One says it was performed by the King's Men, at the Globe, and the other one says never clap or clawed or play stale before an audience. So two quartos coming out the same year with absolutely contradictory prefaces, and one of them refers to the grand possessors who opposed publication. And so this was probably a pirated play in 1609.
But the original title is, and so Farina in his book points out that Samuel Taylor Coleridge said that this was the most difficult play to characterize. And I find that funny, pun intended, because the original title of the play is the tragedy of Troilus and Cressida.
No, the original title of the play in Quarto 1 is the history. The revised Quarto, same year, the famous history. In the quarto, in the folio, it is the tragedy. Now, it's not even listed in the index of the folio. It is inserted between Coriolanus and the history plays, Henry VIII and Coriolanus. So it is misplaced. It is unpaginated in the folio. So, and Timon of Athens was put in its place. So Troilus doesn't appear in the index, and it's mysteriously inserted between the histories and the tragedies, which kind of, fits its own special genre. So
it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it's publication.
Talk about its own mystery, like just inserted in the middle of the folio, this giant tome, this huge undertaking.
Yes.
And it's just inserted in the middle and not even included in the table of contents.
It would suggest that they had trouble getting the rights to publish it at that time.
So I think that's all fascinating. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that interesting introduction to it in the 1609 printing, that very famous
right, from a never writer to an ever reader.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. News.
Yeah. What do you feel about that? Like some people think that it's a play on the name de Vere.
I agree.
Evere.
Absolutely.
But who is the message to? Is it a secret message? And who is the message for? Who is the ever reader?
I think the ever reader is, well, this is a very intellectual play. There's a lot of philosophical discourse in the play. You have Ulysses' speech on degree, and you have his discourse with Achilles on the eye metaphor, and whether your valor is based on your actions, and these kinds of things. So these are deep philosophical questions that refer to principles that come out of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Plato's Republic and the First Alcibiades. So these are sourced in some ways that suggest that the audience had to have been a very, very well-educated audience, perhaps one of the Inns of Courts where it was originally produced. Now, we do know that in December 27th, 1584, the Earl of Oxford's boys performed the history of Agamemnon and Ulysses.
That was going to be another question I was going to ask you about. Yeah,
see?
What do you feel about that one?
I feel very positive about that as the first version of this play, and that was what J. Thomas Looney actually proposed originally. So I think that we can follow his argument in that there was another literary reference published in 1584 by William Warner called Pan His Syrinx, in which, in the introductory to the reader passage, he refers to the coy prophetess presaging hard events in her cell, the Athenian misanthropos, or man-hater, biting on the stage, and the Sinopian cynic barking at the stationer. Now, the coy prophetess presaging hard events in her cell has got to be Cassandra.
Sure, of course.
Okay.
Right.
She wouldn't go with Apollo. He made her a prophetess whose prophecy no one would believe. The Sinopian cynic biting on the stage is a reference to an early Timon drama. When you bite on the stage, that means you are showing a biting satire. And then you have the Sinopian cynic, which is a reference to the great Latin playwright and mentioned in the introductory section of Ben Jonson's dedicatory epistles, as the hymn of Cordoba born. Are you with me, Stephen?
I'm with you. I'm following.
Yes. So there's references to three plays, and the Earl of Oxford's boys did perform this. Diogenes is a Sinopian cynic. Okay, and Diogenes was a character in Campaspe, which was John Lilly's play, which was published in 1584. So we have numerous references to the Earl of Oxford's boys performing a Trojan drama in 1584. And that was a very, very significant time that ties the Earl of Oxford into a political crisis that England was facing in terms of the ramp up to war with Spain and the factions that existed at the English court between William Cecil and the Earl of Sussex, Thomas Radcliffe on one side that Oxford was affiliated with, and the Earl of Leicester, Christopher Hatton, and Philip Sidney on the other side, pushing for war with Spain. So we'll have more to talk about that as we get into the play.
And before we dive deep into like the metaphors and the characters the people from court that these characters are based on, I want to touch back on the source material just a bit, because I love the autobiographical connections to the source material, especially when you look at Homer's Iliad, right? And George Chapman. A chap named Chapman, by the way, was involved in this. George Chapman was translating Homer's Iliad to English at the time that he was quite good friends with, guess who? Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And Chapman even writes this very eloquent poem to Oxford, calling him this man of grace, almost in Homeric terms, as this, legendary hero. And then when you connect to, there's the Iliad, then you get the Aeneid, right? The Aeneid being translated at the time that it was being translated into English by none other than an uncle of, guess who? Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, right? His uncle Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Then you've got the story we talk about all the time, and it's such a big one with Midsummer Night's Dream. One of your favorites and mine is Ovid's Metamorphosis, and of course, who's translating that is Edward de Vere's other uncle, Arthur Golding. So here are these three giant Greek sources, all being translated into English by people that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, has a strong, immediate personal connection with.
Well, it even goes deeper than that, because one of William Cecil's early charges was a man by John Hall, who translated the first 10 books of the Iliad while he was in residence. This is out of the French version translation. While he was in residence at Cecil House with Arthur Golding and the Earl of Oxford. Now, the Earl of Oxford also, in 100 Sundry Flowers, which was published in 1576, wrote under, and Roger Strittmatter could certainly confirm this, a pseudonym, Meritum Petere Grave. And Meritum Petere Grave wrote a series of poems about Troilus and Cressida. So if the Earl of Oxford is writing poetry about the Troilus and Cressida as a pseudonym early in his career, in his 20s, consider the possibility that in his 30s he would be writing a play about this same subject. Now, a very recent article was a chapter in a book called Shakespeare in Greece was published in 2017. And the title of the article is Greece Digested in a Play, Consuming Greek Heroism in the School of Abuse and Troilus and Cressida. And the School of Abuse was Thomas Gasson's 1579 attack on the theater. It was a slam against all things theatrical, except, of course, he mentions two plays that were probably worth seeing. One was called Ptolemy, and the other one was The Jew, arguably perhaps the first versions of Antony and Cleopatra and The Merchant of Venice. But he uses the Greek heroes as exemplars that poets should be writing about and magnifying the power and the respect for and the admiration for and the emulation of the ancient Greek heroes, the Hectors and the Agamemnons and the Ulysses of ancient Greek literature, and that going to the theater, especially if you're a woman, would be elderly, the worst thing you could do, that you would become feminized by seeing things performed on the stage, among other things. He had a huge thing about why women should never go, and that their reputation would be destroyed if they were ever seen at a theater. He went on, of course, to be kind of a Puritan minister at St. Botolph's Church, which is very near Fisher's Folly. Anyway. So Gasson attacks the theaters in 1579, and there's no real reaction to this. But 4 years later, perhaps, the Earl of Oxford writes a play in which all those Greek heroes that Gasson wanted to put up on the pedestal were dehumanized, deconstructed, deglamorized into the most pernicious and insulting versions of them in any of the sources. I mean, in the original Iliad, of course, these are elevated beings who are godlike in their powers and their strength and in their intelligence and actions. And in the medieval sources, the similar shows great respect. But Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida completely undoes it and reverses in paradoxical ways the sense of respect and admiration you hold for any of these characters. I mean, Achilles is turned into an egotistical, insolent, coward, hanging out in his tent while, Patroclus does scurril jests and,
right.
acts out the Agamemnon and Nestor and other characters. So there's a meta-theatrical thing going on in that tent. So
and a lot of very derogatory comments about homosexuality there too.
Absolutely.
Like a condemnation of the relationship
Yes.
between Achilles and Patroclus is very specific and very pointed.
At the same time, Achilles has been seduced by Polyxena, the daughter of Priam and Hecuba, and the younger sister of Troilus and Hector, and is secretly exchanging letters with her and won't go to war because Hecuba urged him not to go out and fight against the Trojans. So because of his romantic interest, so you have a completely, unheroic Achilles and one who orders his myrmidons essentially to murder an unarmed Hector. In the end, it is the most awful assassination almost in all of Shakespeare, the way that occurs. And so
I don't know, King Duncan, that's a pretty wicked assassination, I have to say.
All
The
right.
guy's asleep and they stab him savagely to death.
Hey, at least Macbeth took credit for killing him, whereas Achilles took credit for not killing him because it was his minions that all descended on Hector, the unarmed Hector, and killed him. And it's interesting that there are passages from untranslated chapters in Homer's Iliad that Chapman had yet to publish. He did not publish the full 24 books, I believe, until 1612. And that was at least 3 years after the first quarto was published. Okay, and there are references to things that are noted that are parallels in Shakespeare that come out of Book 18, Book 20, Book 22 of the Iliad. And David Bevington in his edition raises the question that Shakespeare must have been sitting by Chapman's shoulder watching him do the translation.
Well, I was going to ask you that. You say, do you think that Oxford assisted Chapman with that translation? Because we do know that Oxford was highly familiar.
Yeah.
Oxford was very familiar with the Italian version of the Iliad because William Cecil Lord Burleigh had a copy in his library at the time that Edward was being raised in his household. So wouldn't you, the most Italianate of earls, we've heard him described as so many times. So if you're Chapman and you're friends with this guy, wouldn't you ask him to come and look over your shoulder? Wouldn't you ask him to sort of, be your editor or at least your proofreader?
I don't know that we have Chapman as one of the, university wits that were around Oxford, like Lilly, Munday, Green, Nash, and others. But he did, of course, praise him in his play, The Revenge of Bussy d'Amboise, which was, of course, published after the Earl of Oxford's death, which is where that passage, I think, comes from that you were citing earlier about his noble nature. So Chapman certainly was inspired by this.
As liberal as the sun,
as liberal
he
as
calls
the sun.
him.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about an Apollo reference right there.
Oh, no. Chapman clearly did admire Oxford, but I don't know about a personal relationship or a direct relationship or connection in that regard that we would have between the two of them. But the other sources, would have been in the libraries of Cecil and Thomas Smith, where Oxford lived. There's passages from the first Alcibiades that is clearly part of the discourse between. Then that's Plato. And we know the Earl of Oxford, when he was 19 years old, purchased an edition to Plutarch's Lives, which was Amiot's French translation, Plato in folio. So he had a complete
And
collection.
we also know that he purchased and owned a copy of Chaucer.
And Chaucer at the same time.
Yeah.
So from the time he was a teenager, Oxford was interested in all these things that we're talking about in Troilus and Cressida. So there's no question about that in my mind. So I do think if you date this play, the earliest version of it in 1584, you will find when you look at the various characterizations and the possible allegorical parallels between the characters, there's a great deal of personal connection between the Earl of Oxford's life. Now, you consider Earl of Oxford as Troilus as a stand-in for the Earl of Oxford, obviously.
Most scholars agree with that. Most scholars who have touched on it would say that the author character, whether they're a Stratfordian or an Oxfordian or a Baconian or whoever, they would say that the author character is Troilus. Now, there are some who have posited that Achilles is Oxford because of the homosexual connection. But as we pointed out, I think he wouldn't self-deprecate that severely and had undergone accusations and almost had his head chopped off because of having to defend himself against those types of accusations. Well, so I like the Troilus comparison much better.
Well, there's nothing truer than Troilus. The Oxford's motto, "Virhu nihil virius," nothing is truer than truth. And the word truth and associated with Troilus comes up in at least 5 or 10 different passages within the play. Troilus identifies with him as the truth. Of course, he has this naive, youthful view of the power of love, and he's and the truthfulness of love, and how and Cressida, of course, is associated with the falsehood of love, and those words are associated with her, but. True and truth and truthiness are Troilus's thing. And there's one particular image in the play that may actually point very directly at the Earl of Oxford. And in The Star of England, Charlton Ogburn Sr. and his wife were commenting on a passage in which Queen Elizabeth is known to have mocked Oxford when he was younger for having a single white hair on his chin. And Helen of Troy in Troilus and Cressida mocks Troilus. There's a long passage that Pandarus goes on and on and on about this for the single hair on his chin because he's not so manly. That's the implication, of course. But the idea, the image of that single hair that takes up a long passage in the play may in fact reflect to an actual historical event.
It makes me think of Francis Flute. Oh, let me play not a woman. I have a beard coming. and Peter Quint says, oh, that's all one. And in many productions, they have Peter Quint pluck a hair off of Francis Flute's chin.
Yes. Well, let's go on. So nothing is truer than truth. Troilus says, what truth can speak truest not truer than Troilus. And he says, I am as true as truth's simplicity and simpler than the infancy of truth. So as truth's authentic author, to be cited as true as Troilus, to shall crown up the verse and sanctify the numbers. It's a bit grandiose, his naive interpretation of what love will deliver. And of course, he's immediately, corrected by this as soon as Diomedes runs off with Cressida, and he has that horrible scene in which he witnesses the seduction scene between the two of them. Well, let's talk a bit about Cressida, since she's the other name
Absolutely.
character in this. And
so you say it's Anne Vavasor.
I do. And Anne Vavasor was 10 years younger than the Earl of Oxford, came to court when she was 16 years old. She was sponsored, I'm sure, by her uncle Thomas Knivet, but also her cousin Charles Arundel, who was one of Earl of Oxford's closest friends at the time. So he was introduced to by Henry Howard and Charles Arundel. And Arundel and Howard were in the 1581 period of time would write the most scurrilous libels against the Earl of Oxford after he busted them for being part of the Catholic plot in front of Elizabeth. He confessed his own affiliation with them and that he was no longer wanting to relate to that. And afterwards, they were, of course, arrested, placed in house arrest in Christopher Hatton's house, and then wrote a 100-page monstrous adversary-driven a diatribe against the Earl of Oxford, accusing him of murder, of pederasty, of necrophilia, of all sorts of horrible things. So they wrote a long libel against him. But I think it was Charles Arundel that may be the person that really introduced Oxford to Vavasor, but Henry Howard was also part of that scene. She was known as, and I'm quoting here, perhaps the most remarkable aristocratic courtesan of the Elizabethan era, known to be clever, witty, and caustic, just like Cressida. Cressida's quite witty. She
just like Oxford.
And
it's like peas of a pod there, right?
Right. And she says, she swears by all Diana's waiting women. Okay. Now, Diana's an affiliation with Queen Elizabeth. Okay.
Sure.
So she's referring to the women of the bedchamber, the waiting women. And she was one of those waiting women until 1581 when she delivered the Earl of Oxford's bastard son, Edward de Vere. So, so you have a lot of close associations between Cressida and Vavasor. And here's the other thing is that when she delivered the child, Edward de Vere, in March 1581, both Edward and Anne and the child were placed in the Tower of London.
Yes.
And who ran the Tower of London but Sir Henry Lee, the Queen's champion? And 3 years later, she bore Henry Lee's son. So he would be a stand-in for Diomedes, the one who took Cressida away from Troilus.
So she uses her feminine wiles and powers of seduction against her jailer for favor of some sort, right?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And this was the theme that many scholars have noted of John Lidley's Endymion, which was performed and published in 1588. So also contemporaneous with all these things going on. So there were allegorical narratives that were close to the Earl of Oxford that ties him with Anne Vavasor, and Corsides as the jailer at that time would be a stand-in for Henry Lee.
She certainly was a remarkable woman, and you got to give her kudos. You're locked in the tower with your baby, and what are you going to do? What do you have at your disposal in Elizabethan England to help you survive this terrible ordeal? If you can convince your jailer to be nice to you because you can give a few little favors here or there.
Absolutely.
That's not a terrible choice for a new mother who is worried about being sentenced to death.
Right. Now, you think of the Earl of Oxford's position in jail for several months at that time. Well, Henry Lee has free access.
Of course he does.
So the sense of jealous rage must have been, extreme, I think.
And in, a few episodes back, we had Dorothea Dickerman on talking about the loves of Oxford, and she talked about where Anne Vavasor ends up, and married to a sea captain, and having basically she was a polygamist.
She was a polygamist. Yeah. She had to pay a £2,000 fine. Yeah.
She there's that's a biography I'd love to read. Just her whole life story.
Absolutely. Well, Edmund Spenser and Walter Raleigh were both really interested in her, and Raleigh even wrote her a poem to warn her about getting involved with the Earl of Oxford. So really, in her teenage years, she was the hottie at court, apparently.
Apparently.
So let me go on a little bit more with this allegorical discussion, since I think we can clearly identify these. And for quillers who are interested in looking into this a little bit deeper, I did give a presentation on this question in 2016, and it's in the SOF video file for our conferences.
Okay,
and the title of it is 1584 Shakespeare's Greek Satires of Misanthropy and War.
And if you're listening and you want to find this, you can go to the SOF YouTube page, where you'll find not only that video, but a ton of great videos from previous conferences over the years on a variety of different subjects. And so you can just rabbit hole into YouTube for quite some time if you'd like to view some of these presentations, as opposed to going to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, where you can also then find literary materials as well on a lot of these topics and subjects, and you can read to your heart's content as well if you go there. So ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship YouTube channel, great sources for additional information for those who are finding themselves intrigued.
So let's go on a little bit more. Now, Ulysses, one of the most interesting characters in this, who really manipulates the whole scene. He manipulates Ajax into the duel with Hector. He manipulates Achilles in some ways to be envious of this rivalry that he has with Ajax, who's been chosen by the Greeks to do that. Then he confronts him over the letter that he's been exchanging with Polyxena, and then he takes Troilus and positions him in a place where he witnesses the betrayal that Cressida performs with her interlude with Diomedes before the final act. So he really, really kind of is very manipulative and very intelligent and very, very successful in that way.
He's sort of the Iago character of this play.
He is the William Cecil of this play. I mean, really, he was at that time in 1584. Cecil was affiliated with. He was kind of isolated, actually, because Leicester and Sidney, Walsingham and Hatton were all for going to war with Spain. William Cecil was trying to avoid war at all costs. Thomas Radcliffe, the Earl of Sussex, was his ally in this regard. Sussex was more of an isolationist, and I think he's actually a stand-in for Hector. We'll talk a little bit about that. But William Cecil was the spy master during this time. And he comments on the fact that when he's having this discourse with Achilles, that they know all about his discourse in his letters exchanges that is going on secretly with Polyxena. So he's exposing him. We know about your secret romance and why you're really not going to war with us, because your pride has been wounded, but also you're restrained, you're constrained because of your love for the daughter of Priam and Hecuba. But then again, he gives that wonderful speech about the providence, that's in a watchful state, knows almost every grain of Pluto's gold, finds bottom in the incomprehensive deeps, the deep state. He's talking about the deep state here.
Well, there's no state deeper than Elizabethan court, I'll tell you that.
It's Keats' place of thought, and almost like the gods do thoughts unveil their dumb cradles. And so he's talking about the fact that behind the scene, we understand what's going on perfectly well. So he's well positioned as a Cecil type character who's aware of what's going on throughout the state and manipulates in some regards to get his successful. So then opposed to him would be the Earl of Leicester, and the Earl of Leicester is a good stand-in for Achilles in this point. Most scholars, if you're looking at the dating of the plays around 1600, associate Achilles with the Earl of Essex, the Earl of Leicester's son-in-law.
Sure. Stepson?
He married.
I think it's a stepson, yeah?
Yeah, it's a stepson.
Yeah.
Stepson.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that, but I think if you look at this as a political allegory, a critical political allegory, in the mid-1580s, then the Earl of Leicester is a better stand-in for.
Well, especially if we're right that this originally started out as the story of Agamemnon and Ulysses,
right,
and then got converted to this version. It would make no sense that Essex would even be a part of it.
Absolutely, he was nobody at court that time. Right. So Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was, of course, and Dorothea made very good points about the closeness and bond Connor has made this point about her closeness with the Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And how he infuriated the Queen when he secretly married Lettice Knollys, who was Essex's mother in 1578 and was put in house arrest and all that. But he had a reputation at court as being kind of an Achilles-like character, the way Shakespeare portrays him in this. He was known as, I think William Camden referred to him as the great genius, the evil genius of the court. That's what Camden called him. And in 1584, the same year that this play is being produced, it was the publication and distribution of Leicester's Commonwealth. Okay, so Leicester's Commonwealth was an attack on the Earl of Leicester, accusing him of poisoning the Earl of Essex, of killing other people, even a threat to the Earl of Sussex.
Even one of his own wives.
Okay.
Or maybe two.
Right.
He might have been a serial killer.
Yeah. And so he was the Machiavellian master courtier, according to the Commonwealth, which, was thought to have been possibly written by Charles Arundel, the same man who in 1581 wrote the 100 pages of scurrilous attacks on the Earl of Oxford. Okay? The same guy might have been behind both those treasonous
It's one of the aspects of the Elizabethan court that I think is one of the things that clouds a lot of this, is that there was so much contention going on between these earls, and the Queen, I believe, fostered that. She liked to foster that competition between these men.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's one of the things that, and then, some of them become allies against a common enemy. Then they turn on each other again. Like it's a terrible cats and dogs thing going on throughout the entire Elizabethan era between these great earls.
We have, between the Earl of Sussex and the Earl of Leicester, you have a long history of conflicts that go over 15 years. In 1560s, it was the Earl of Sussex who prevented the marriage of the Earl of Leicester to Queen Elizabeth. He was the one that kind of stepped in and told her it was not a good idea for her to marry the love of her life, but because he was already married to Amy Robsart, who mysteriously
fell down the stairs. Is she the one who fell down the stairs?
She is the one.
Quote unquote.
Yeah. And then later on, it got so bad that one was wearing purple ribbons with their backers and the other was wearing yellow ribbons, just like the War of the Roses. The factions went back that far. Okay, it had been going on. And so the conservative factions led by Sussex and Cecil, and Oxford affiliated with that group, were opposed, of course, by Leicester and his followers, primarily Philip Sidney and Christopher Hatton, who, after Sussex's death in 1583, switched allegiances and went over to Leicester. Okay, so like Ajax, he switched from being affiliated with Agamemnon and Nestor and Ulysses and went over to the faction represented by Achilles and Patroclus. So there's another switching of allegiances, as you said suggested earlier. And Leicester's referred to as being someone who was insolent. Okay, especially in Leicester's Commonwealth. Well, the word insolent and insolence comes up repeatedly in reference to Achilles on at least 3 different occasions. He's referred to as being insolent. So we have some associations there. So
it's sort of like a compendium to some of these other works that have been produced, right? These pamphlets and these literary attacks. And here Oxford takes all of that, puts this layer of these great Greek pieces of literature on top of it, makes these strong comparisons.
Yes.
And I would argue one of the reasons why we have this ambiguous nature of the title is that there had to be this sort of shadowy presentation of this play so as to for it to not suffer pure censorship and destruction.
Well, if it's
a comedy. It's just funny. It's okay.
Absolutely.
These are just jokes.
Comical satire. That's it. Well, depending on the dating of the plays, the whole political interpretation goes forward or not. And I'm, again, pushing a very early dating of this play, which would fly on the face of what most scholars had said. But I think there's reasons to think that this might actually be the case. There are euphuistic passages within this play that suggest the styles of the mid-1580s.
And I was going to say, stylometrically, I think it shows that it's an earlier work, too. Because there are parts of it that are great, and there are parts of it that he's still working out the kinks on his style and how well he can write certain scenes and certain passages of dialogue that kind of fall flat. And you go, okay, here's a yawn moment as we move forward.
So let's go back a little bit to the political allegory argument that I'm kind of putting forward here.
Okay, because I want, before we run out of time,
we're not going to run out of time.
I want to dive into, of course, who Pandarus represents.
Well, I'm going to get to that.
Is that where you're headed now?
No,
okay,
I'm on my way.
Okay, groovy.
But let's talk about Hector,
Yes.
because I believe he is the most respected hero in this play. He is given great intelligence, and yet he's deeply ambivalent. He goes on in the scene early on in Act 1 when they're gathered at the War Council in Troy, and he is arguing that they should let Helen go, and that you can't teach philosophy to young men like Paris and Troilus. They don't understand what the consequences are and the sufferance of the war and all that. And then he says, and yet I've issued a challenge, and to go out and fight the greatest of the Greek warriors, and then
put an end to all of this.
We'll settle
One-to-one.
mano a mano, So his ego and his pride push him in one direction, and his intelligence puts him in another direction. So he's kind of troubled and tragic in that larger sense. I mean, during the play, there's an actual scene in which he could kill Achilles, and he backs off. And then, of course, in the very next scene, the Myrmidons come and kill him when he's unarmed. So there's things about Hector that are tragical and lead him, and it is the inevitable and ironic conclusion, of course, that he must die in this story. But he's an admirable character, and Aeneas is probably the only other truly admirable character who acts from chivalric and from the kind of culture and ethics that you would expect to be honored in this way. Pretty much everybody else is not respected by the playwright. In
not a lot of redeeming characters. No.
So who was Sussex? Well, he was a sponsor for the Earl of Oxford. In fact, when Oxford was 19, he was part of Sussex's campaign against the Northern Rebellion, in which he witnessed a number of conspirators hung and, villages burned and this kind of stuff. That the suppression of the Northern Rebellion was done rather brutally, but that was the Earl of Sussex's charge. He was called to go and put down these people, these Catholic that were fighting against Queen Elizabeth.
Elizabeth was one of the inventors of shock and awe.
Yes. But here's what Elizabeth Jenkins says about Thomas Radcliffe. His chivalry and integrity, his brusque honesty and protective tenderness had been Elizabeth's asset ever since she came to the throne. So he had a lifelong supportive relationship and good relationship with Elizabeth. He was also the Lord Chamberlain, which he took over from the Earl of Essex for a decade between 1572 and 1583 when he mysteriously died. But there was enmity, of course, between him and Leicester through much of this time. And, in 1581, according to Elizabeth Jenkins again, the enmity between Leicester and Sussex blazed up again in such violence that it broke out in a shocking scene in the Queen's presence where they accused each other of being traitors. Okay? So when he died in 1583, he told Hatton, "Beware the gypsy," because you do not know him. That's what he told Christopher Hatton. That's well recorded. That Sussex was, until his dying breath, was warning everybody about him. But on his death in 1583, his players probably entered the service of Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. That's according to Francis Flea. Mm-hmm. So, his association and this theatrical connection with the Earl of Oxford during this time, helping promote him and promote his playmaking behind the scenes, must have been just phenomenal. They were very, very close. So no wonder Hector is treated so admirably
that makes total sense because, when you look at Oxford's life, one of the glaring things that is missing throughout most of his later life is the presence of those male influences and mentors that existed in his early life.
Right.
And so here you're pointing to one that has sort of been behind the scenes in the shadows, supporting this young man,
yes, helping
him to achieve what it is, the greatness that he so deserves to achieve. And that's very rare because, once he comes into his majority, he tends to be on the bad side of just about everybody for a while.
Well, according to Roger Strittmatter, he was the most downwardly mobile nobleman in English history.
Right.
In the 1580s. In 1584, it was almost the peak of his financial crisis. He didn't get rescued until 1586 when the 1,000-pound annuity began to be, he received that as supportive for his living expenses for
well, and
whatever
then
reason.
as we know, much later in life, it's his final wife who rescues him. Really,
Yeah.
she
So
saves him from doom.
let's go a little bit further into the play now.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk about Patroclus. Now, Patroclus is associated with the Earl of Oxford. He's, according to Thucydides, his male varlet. So he was closely affiliated with him. And the long speech that Achilles gives in the opening scenes with the Greek War Council, in which he describes Patroclus as pageanting them all, with his, hamstring and making scurril jests that make Achilles crack up and almost break ribs. He's laughing so hard in the stand because of the mockery, the burlesquing of the Greek generals and the leaders by Patroclus. Okay, so Patroclus is known early in the play, recognized as a playwright and performer. Well, Philip Sidney wrote plays. He wrote poetry, of course, but he wrote pageants. So you're pageanting them. He wrote pageants, and perhaps the most famous pageant he wrote was the Fortress of Perfect Beauty, which was performed before the 400 French ambassadors in 1581. So very contemporaneous, in which the whole narrative, the whole story, the whole allegory was to suggest that Queen Elizabeth would never marry the French Duke Alençon, who was there. They were there to negotiate that. So he was pageanting. He's wrote pageants, and these were to convince Elizabeth and to show the French that there was no hope that she would ever marry.
Patroclus is pretty much personified then as like a court jester.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And to attach that to a fellow nobleman.
Absolutely.
Here, let me stick this pencil in your eye.
Oxford called him a puppy, when they had their little tennis court thing back in 1579, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so
falling out when young men falling out at tennis.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so Sidney may be, because of his uncle was Leicester. The two of them were closely affiliated. He went in Leicester's company to the Low Countries in the mid 1580s to fight the Spanish there. So he was very closely affiliated with the Earl of Leicester and would naturally fill the role as a Patroclus who was mocking and pageanting.
Okay. So earlier at the beginning of this portion, you said, closely affiliated with the Earl of Oxford, but you meant closely affiliated with the Earl of Leicester. And if Achilles is Leicester, then Patroclus is Sidney.
Absolutely.
And it's that relationship that Oxford is lampooning there.
Absolutely.
And attacking, and both specific enemies of his.
Absolutely.
We know for a fact enemies of his.
And now we have Ajax. Okay, now Ajax is one of the most interesting and problematic characters. I mean, he's made up to be an utter buffoon, repeatedly described by Alexander, the servant of the Trojans, and also by Thucydides, of course, on and on about all his paradoxes about him.
He's like Ox in the Archie cartoons, right? the big dumb lummox.
And he can be played that way. He can play like a real dolt, you know.
Yeah.
and he's strutting around, talking to himself in like the grand heroic terms.
Like,
I mean,
Hulk smash.
He's actually the target of more mockery in this play than any other character, actually, I think. And I think he's a stand-in for Christopher Hatton, who also had, was competitive with Oxford, who wanted the Queen's favor, who switches allegiance like Ajax does from the Cecil over to the Leicester.
Who is cross-gartered in yellow stockings in Twelfth Night, right?
Yes. And, he was privileged, Mary Queen of Scots accused him of having an affair with Elizabeth, Leicester and Oxford weren't the only ones that were apparently close to her. He switches allegiance like Ajax. And the one image that definitely you can affiliate Ajax with the Christopher Hatton. Hatton was known as Elizabeth Mouton or sheep, but his also nickname was Lids. Leicester was her eyes, and Hatton were her lids. Okay, so there's a passage in which, and he's also known for having written a melancholy poetry. Okay, there's from the 100 Sunny Flowers. There's some Hatton passages that suggest.
Well, and that rings true to the personification in Twelfth Night too, because when you look at Malvolio, he's the wet rag of the play, right? He's trying to put a damper on everyone and everything throughout the play. Until he reads the note they leave for him, and suddenly he's, I'm going to be king. I'm going to marry the queen.
Absolutely. So this is a passage from Alexander's discussion of Ajax. He is melancholy without cause, and merry against the hair. He hath the joints of everything, but in everything so out of joint that he is a gouty Briareus, all hands and no use, or purblind Argus, all eyes and no sight. So here's the Lid's reference. Argus was the 100-eyed monster that Hera put in charge of Io to keep an eye on Io, so that Io, who she knew was one of, she was now a cow, okay, and that Zeus is going to come back and want more services from Io, converting her back into the girl that she is.
Yes.
So Argus is watching her. Well, then Hermes comes along and puts Argus to sleep and then blinds him. But the idea of eyes and pure blind, not seeing everything, and lids as the association with Christopher
the
Hatton.
shroud over sight.
So now let's
lids.
get to your Pandarus.
Oh,
okay?
yes, please. Yes,
right.
This is the one I've been waiting for.
All right.
Yeah.
So
because he's such a scumbag.
He is. And I think if Charles Arundel, the cousin of Anvavassar, and of course Pandarus is the uncle and referred to as cousin by Cressida. He refers to her as her cousin. There is a direct relationship between Charles Arundel and I think Henry.
And we know in Elizabethan times that any relation was referred to as a cousin.
That's true.
It didn't, whether it was your uncle, your nephew, your niece, or your actual cousin through parents who were brothers and sisters with each other, like kind of yeah. So a cousin was basically kinsman. Right. Of any kind.
Right. And the Earl of Oxford would have more bones to pick with Charles Arundel than just about anybody else, including Sidney and Leicester, because of the horrible things he wrote in those libels that Alan Nelson has taken as literal truth. Alan Nelson in Monstrous Adversary, which is taken directly, it's a quote from Arundel's libels against Oxford in that era. And they were just writing these things to attack Oxford, who had exposed their plotting and their Catholic sympathies. And basically he went to the Fleet prison and then went into exile and died, I think, in Spain at some point. So he was really a despicable character in many regards. And I knew the Earl of Oxford had gone to him to say, well, listen, let's clear the deck. And he tried to negotiate with him to come out on his side, but Arundel, affiliated with Hatton and with Henry Howard, the Earl of Oxford's other cousin, who also turned against him at that time. So I think that Pandarus is probably Arundel or Henry Howard. He's kind of a mix of both those characters that were close to Oxford, cousins, friends, and who introduced him to Vavassar and who basically set him up.
Pushed her upon him, as it were.
Yeah.
And now the Howards, ironically, I always find this funny because it was the Howards who were also a part of serving as a Pandarus, as it were, for Anne Boleyn with Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father.
Sure.
So the history kind of repeats itself here. These Howards love to shove their female relations forward into the chambers of royalty and offer them up as these, pseudo prostitutes in some ways. It's really an interesting cycle with these Howards.
Yes. Well, I think that the Pandarus represents something of an amalgam of those two characters. And then finally, you've got Helen, who's going to be, of course, Queen Elizabeth, the most beautiful woman in the world. I mean, of course, this would suit her quite well. Who kind of has a silent role. She really only insists that Pandarus sings songs, and she has no real role in the dramatic unfoldment other than as a symbol of beauty and conflict, between the various factions.
So you're saying he basically leaves her alone in this one?
I think he leaves her alone because he's in a troubled relationship. He wants her support. He's not going to make Helen look real bad. She's simply the most beautiful woman, available in the whole world that Paris is awarded for because he makes the proper
I like
judgment.
that interpretation, Earl, because it seems to me then that if you look at this entire legend, the Iliad and all, like it's all surrounds Helen. It's all because of Helen.
Yes.
And so here the Earl of Oxford is saying all of these things that are happening in this play are all because of Helen. All of the things happening at court are all because of our Helen, the queen.
Yes.
Everyone's behaving in this way and fighting with each other and going to war and killing each other because of her.
Yes.
And it's all caused by this. I say she promoted it all. I say she enjoyed watching them fight with each other like dogs and go at it with each other. I think it's one of the least redeeming aspects of her. I mean, the more and more I delve into this, the more and more I really can't stand that woman.
Well, I think she had certain neurotic tendencies and had control issues, of course. but she was ruling at a very difficult time. I mean, economically, military-wise, a religious conflict, really it was an extremely turbulent time. And I have more sympathy for her perhaps than you do in that regard. But I do think that she was elevated in the sense of being the Helen. And then, of course, Paris would be the current favorite in the 1580s, mid-1580s, which would have been Walter Raleigh, would have been the person that probably would have been the model for Paris in some regards. I don't think.
What was Raleigh's relationship with Leicester?
Well, Raleigh was suspected by Leicester. They were opposed to each other.
So Raleigh could be the Paris who, with the arrow,
Yes.
takes that Achilles down, right?
It very well could have been. I mean, the Earl of Leicester probably died of natural causes because he was old enough possibly to do that. But yeah, Raleigh was definitely somebody that Leicester did not have a great deal of sympathy for. Leicester, here's a quote. Leicester feared Hatton. Hatton feared Oxford. And they were all united in their dislike of Raleigh. Even though Raleigh did help Oxford get back into the good graces with the Queen in 1583, he was the one that kind of carried that one forward. So I did think that I could summarize my interpretation of this play, and I have this in the final slide of my little slideshow. This is a quote from me. Troilus is an allegory, a political allegory that invites interpretation of authorial intent to malign the war party of Leicester, Sidney, and Hatton, to elevate the recently deceased Sussex as Hector, and to expose the machination of Cecil as Ulysses, and to show Anne Vavasor as an inconstant drab. No, she's called, historically, William Cecil called her a drab. So does Thersites in the play call her a drab. So, and the theme of the play, the feeling of the play is so disturbing. It's very Euripidean in that regard.
I would agree with that assessment. Yeah. Euripides being one of my favorite of the Greeks. And whenever I produce and present a Greek tragedy, I tend to go to his versions over any other versions that are out there that may be of the same title. Like, for instance, Trojan Women is one of my great favorites. And, you talk about Cassandra. She's personified so well in that play.
Yes.
And if you're not familiar with Trojan Women, it is the story of the women of Troy in the aftermath of the war, in the fall of Troy.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful, beautiful tragedy. It's a magnificent play. I've produced it twice now, and I love that play. One thing see...
since we're talking about Euripides, I'm just going to bring up one thing here. There were not that many plays of Euripides translated into English or Latin during that time that were extant in England. Iphigenia at Aulis, Medea would have been two of them, and Hecuba would have been another. But the George Gascon, who was affiliated with William Cecil, put on an English translation of a French translation of the Phoenicae, the Phoenician women of Euripides, at Gray's Inn in 1566, about the time the Earl of Oxford matriculated to Gray's Inn. So there was a production of a Euripides play, translation of a Euripides play, about the Phoenician women, which is really about the undoing of Thebes because of the conflict between Eteocles and Polynices, Oedipus's sons, who go to war over this. And the one passage certainly that unites Troilus and Cressida with the Phoenician women is what A.D. Nuttall calls a tikoscopia, the Greek word that means referencing the fact that there's an observer on at the castle naming the various warriors that come in after the battle. Okay, so Antigone does this in the Phoenician women and has identified all the generals that are fighting with Polynices, her brother, who's in the field against Eteocles, who's defending the gate, and of course they kill each other in the end.
Right, so. and then that leads to the play Antigone,
right,
where the one brother is judged to have been
right
in the just, and the other brother was judged to have been
right,
a traitor in his body.
It was the dust on Polynices that caused them to
Right. She says, I want to bury my brother. He deserves burial, regardless of the fact that he was judged a traitor.
So you can just imagine the teenage Earl of Oxford is sitting in the theater at Gray's Inn watching this wonderful new translation of a Greek drama, and then he brings back those same images and puts it into Troilus and Cressida, which also occurs, of course, in Homer's Iliad. There's a scene where Helena's observing the Greek generals in the field, and they're being named and characterized as such. So again, likewise, what the Greeks do, which is to build upon the legends and the myths and the writings of the early writers, so that, Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles are all writing based on Homeric tradition and Hesiod tradition and other traditions that come out of the Greek mythology. Shakespeare is taking those same stories and reworking them in a Renaissance way that integrates Homeric, Euripidean, Sophoclean elements and including references to Plato and Aristotle in this magnificent confluence of organic mixing of medieval, ancient, and Renaissance motifs.
Well, you and I absolutely agree and have always agreed on the fact that we believe the Greeks had such a tremendous influence upon this writer, that he had such an affinity for the ancient Greeks as the originators of the craft.
Right.
And of course, where that's going to lead me right now, what I'm going to say next.
Shoot, go ahead.
When are we doing Titus?
Wait a minute. We will do Titus. Now, we haven't quite finished with Troilus yet.
Okay, because I still will always say that Titus Andronicus is his greatest homage to Greek tragedy.
We will get into that very soon.
Good.
Before the end of the year, certainly.
One thing I don't see a lot of is you don't see a lot of productions of Troilus and Cressida.
No.
I've only seen it performed once in my lifetime, and it was at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival several years ago. They did a production, and their concept of it was they set it sort of in like the Middle East.
They did
like Afghanistan.
Iraq War. It was the Iraq War.
Yeah, like Desert Storm kind of a theme to it.
I thought that was a brilliant production myself.
I liked the concept. I think it played extremely well to most degree. I think some stuff was added that didn't advance the story, like them shooting golf balls and
snorting cocaine
and shooting. Yeah, like there was stuff in there that like I was like, really that's not helping the story or advancing the story. Yeah, I would agree.
But what was really spooky was when Cassandra walked through the set across the stage, uttering her prophecy of, cry, Trojans, cry, Hector is dead, Hector is dead. And they did this with, she was mic'd, and they did this kind of mystical echoing voice of a prophetess. Spooky. Really got me. And
I remember their Ajax being this big, giant guy who was very doltish. And I have to say, I think that their Pandrus stole the show. Yeah, he was really good. He was quite an actor.
And here's the idea that if you think of this as a 1584 play that has political implications and also references the very painful dissolution of his relationship with Anne Vavasor in the early 1581, the baby's born. In 1582, he's wounded in a fight with Thomas Knivet, with the street fighting gangs that were, vying over the honor of Anne Vavasor. It's really very very Romeo and Juliet style of things, but that was very fresh in the Earl of Oxford's experience. And then if he's writing in a way that's to counter the School of Abuse work that Gossam published in 1570 and reflect on the current political implications and his personal stuff, Troilus and Cressida, I think, becomes the most interesting Oxfordian play.
Many people believe that wounding was what resulted in his referencing himself as being lame for the latter part of his life.
In the sonnets.
And in the sonnets particularly.
Yeah.
And some have posited that lame could have meant that whatever the injury was might have rendered him unable to perform his manly duties.
Well, he went on and had children after that. He had, with his son was born in 1593, was it?
But anyone who knows anything about rapier and dagger style fighting, and you go for the thigh, you go for that femoral artery. That's where you're aiming. You don't want to pierce your opponent through the chest. You're actually trying to slice that femoral artery if you can, and if you can, they're done. It's over. Well, it's over real fast, as you know as a doctor.
I think that's probably what happened when the Earl of Oxford was a teenager at Cecil's house, and he ended up
killed the cook,
killed the assistant cook. Yeah.
The
description suggests that there was a femoral artery laceration, and that's how he died from exsanguination.
You bleed to death pretty fast that way.
You would,
is my understanding.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate the opportunity to kind of share these radical ideas and the idea of that this is a dense political allegory that reflects on an age probably 15 years earlier than most scholars are looking at this play, but they all recognize it as having a political bent, and they all differ. Tucker Brook thinks it was a way of provoking the Earl of Essex to bring his rebellion against the Queen and Robert Cecil. Others would say, no, this is an apology for the things that happened with the Earl of Essex. So you find paradoxical interpretations among scholars, but I think that by dating this play early, which would fit with the dates of the Earl of Oxford's activities and interest during that time, I think we have a credible way of interpreting this play that enriches it immensely in terms of its character and what he's saying.
And whether
about
you believe that Cressida is a personification of Anne Vavasour or the Queen or even Anne Cecil, I'll tell you one thing you cannot believe is that she is a personification of Anne Hathaway. And so you call these ideas radical, but I guarantee you all of the listeners listening right now are now walking away from this episode going, well, that play is perhaps one of the most autobiographical of them all. And it's, again, one of the reasons why it has been characterized and categorized throughout its history as a quote-unquote problem play. And as in a previous episode where we discussed two of the other problem plays, one of the things we find about the three major plays that are continuously called problem plays is that they connect to the Earl of Oxford more strongly than any of the other 37 plays in the canon. And I say that's why Stratfordian scholars throughout history have continued to call them problem plays. It's absolutely impossible to connect them to their man. And look how easily we connect them to our man.
Well, and they're also morally troubling stories.
Absolutely they are.
Bertram is not exactly the most admirable of Shakespeare's young heroes.
No, God.
And as a self-consciously painful confessional of some sort.
Absolutely.
Could work in some regard. If you are the soul of the age, as Jonathan Bate has asserted that Shakespeare is, then perhaps reworking the errors of your past and the abuse of the past in dramatic form that exposes your insufficiencies, your mistakes, your errors at one point in your life is a way that you could actually deepen your own experience and deepen your understanding of human nature and make your works the eternal works that Shakespeare's have become.
And in this particular play, Troilus and Cressida, to be able to purge yourself of the anger that you feel and the hurt and loss that you feel due to those who you feel have wronged you in some way throughout that life. That is the hallmark of a writer. That is what writers do. I have a planned episode. So here's a little tidbit for a preview for you fellow Quillers. We have a planned episode. We have a listener who wrote a book who posits that the Earl of Oxford may have suffered from bipolar disorder and solved that through writing.
Oh, I think he was definitely...
Let's look forward to that episode in the future.
At least he was cyclothymic, which is a medical term that suggests a subclinical bipolar personality.
This guest, when he comes on in a future episode, he compares him a lot to Kurt Vonnegut, who specifically said many times in his life that his writing was his therapy, that he had to, or his suicidal tendencies would take over. So it's interesting future topic. And thank you again, Earl, for joining us today. We are completely out of time. Those hours fly by, don't they?
They do. I love this.
And as promised, see, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. You too can suggest a future episode. This episode came as a result of one of our loyal listeners, Quiller Claire. Look at that tongue twister. I can't even get it out. Now she's laughing right now as she's listening. So you can send us an email. You can do it through contact@don'tquillthepod.com. Contact@don'tquillthepod.com. That's a direct email right to the program. Send us your requests. Send us your episode ideas. We'd love to hear from you. Send us your critiques. we accept those as well. And then, of course, send us your praise. We'll always take that too. Yeah, you can do that too. In the meantime, I do know this. I know that there are more listeners of this program than there are active members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, which tells me that some of you out there have been sitting on the fence. Get off the fence. Come join us, would you please? It's not very expensive at all. It's a nominal cost. You get a wonderful benefit of receiving access to our quarterly newsletters, getting updates regularly on activities and actions of the organization. You get to have an active participation in the organization as well, and some other special perks that come throughout the year as we plan events and activities, and we have a symposium that we do. So all of that is a part of a benefit of membership. So please go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. Click on the Join Us button, enter your info, and become a bona fide member, won't you please? Your membership dues go to paying for the outreach programs of this organization, for further research into this wonderful topic. And so you'll know that your contribution as a member is being put to great use and helps advance the Oxfordian cause. So please come join us. We'd love to have you. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so glad that you listen to us wherever and from whoever and wherever you are. And as always, we remind you, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.